Hello, everybody who did not join us for our lovely small class today that is watching this podcast on your Christmas break. This is lesson 4. It's the last lesson that we'll do in chapter 14. If you're counting things, you might say, hey, what happened to lesson 3? Where did that go? Lesson 3 was going to be us doing an activity where you research things about sexually transmitted infections, but we will do it later after the Christmas break when people are here. So the first thing that I need to remind you of that you already know is that there's a chromosomal basis for sex determination. People who have an X and a Y chromosome are genetically male, and people who have 2 X chromosomes are genetically female. You know from our other lessons that there are things that can cause this number of chromosome to change. So we are just going to focus on what is supposed to happen in your typical male or your typical female. The thing that I want to highlight here is the Y chromosome, because it's the one that's different, right? Females have 2 X's, males have an X. The thing that differentiates really males from females is this Y chromosome that males have. The Y chromosome has a gene that the X chromosome doesn't have. This gene causes differentiation of male structures. If this gene is not present or is not activated, so even if the gene is present, but if it's not getting transcribed and translated into a protein, then differentiation of male structures isn't going to happen. Now we're going to see today that testosterone is important for the development of all of these male structures. And so essentially, this gene that's on the Y chromosome helps to differentiate cells that haven't quite yet decided what kind of cell they're going to become male cells. It would be possible for someone who is genetically male to have this gene, but for the gene to not be activated. If the gene isn't activated, the person will likely develop as a female. Sometimes if there's an issue with genes not being activated, the person could end up not really developing either male or female structures properly, but this is what is supposed to happen. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions there? So we're going to talk a bit about the hormones that are involved with males and females to help stimulate the production of reproductive cells. So we'll talk about males first. The basic pathway of endocrine control in males is from the hypothalamus to the pituitary and then the testes. So the pathway that we're going to look at here starts when puberty starts. Now, when does puberty start? That is up for debate. It's different in different people. So when puberty begins, sometime in the early teenage years, but I'm not going to give an exact year, and no one is going to ask you an exact year. So recognize this is not happening in a baby. This is happening in a young adult, young teenager. The first thing that happens is that the hypothalamus produces GnRH. What does that stand for? Well, it's on your data sheet. It is one of the only hypothalamus releasing hormones that you actually need to know the name of. It stands for gonadotropic releasing hormone. So your hypothalamus produces this releasing factor. It is a hormone, which means it travels in the blood. The next part is your pituitary. And you know that your pituitary has two segments to it. So we are specifically talking about your anterior pituitary. In a male and in a female, the same two pituitary hormones are produced. Your pituitary produces FSH and LH. Both of those abbreviations are also on your data sheet if you ever forget what they are. And when I tell you the names, you're going to say, huh, that doesn't really sound like it has anything to do with a male. And it's because the names of the hormones go really well with what they do in a female, let's say, but maybe less well with what they do in a male. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. So those are two of the anterior pituitary hormones that I mentioned briefly at the beginning, where I said, flat pig, that's the F of flat, that's the L of flat. So they're two of those pituitary hormones. And then each of them have an effect. If we talk first about, so here, structures that are in the testes are not just one thing. They're actually a whole bunch of different structures put together. We labeled those in the first lesson of this section. The first one that we'll talk about is the FSH one. So there are seminiferous tubules. You know already that seminiferous tubules are where sperm are produced. So I will write spermatogenesis. So if I want to ask myself, how does this all happen? Gonadotropic releasing hormone stimulates the production of FSH, which stimulates the seminiferous tubules. Now, if we talk about the other part here, the luteinizing hormone affects Leydig cells. So these are the ones that are called interstitial cells. I would say that the higher probability is that they'll be called Leydig cells if you saw them on a test question, but recognize that we're talking about the same thing. Leydig cells produce testosterone. So if I follow this pathway here, that's my pathway. GnRH also stimulates the production of LH in your pituitary, which stimulates Leydig cells to produce testosterone. Now, so far, does anyone want to ask any questions? Okay. Now, like with most things, there are other ways or other effects that happen, one of which is negative feedback. So if I consider testosterone, testosterone affects some of the other structures here. For example, testosterone has a positive influence on the seminiferous tubules, so it contributes to the production of sperm. But testosterone has a negative effect on the production of GnRH. So like with most hormones, once the end product is produced, it inhibits the beginning or the start of the pathway that caused its production. Now there's another hormone that really just has an inhibitory effect. There is a hormone here that is called inhibin. So it's another hormone that's produced. It's produced in the seminiferous tubules, so in that same pathway as FSH. And it has a negative effect on the pituitary. So it will inhibit further production of pituitary hormones. Some of you might know what this is, but for some of you this might be a new word. Has anyone heard of andropause before? It is like menopause. It's like menopause, but for men. So andro, that part of the word, refers to androgens. So androgens are male hormones, testosterone being the principal one that exists. Pause signifies that they are not being produced. So andropause is the decline in hormone levels, usually around the age of 40. This is also when the prostate tends to enlarge. Much like menopause, which probably a lot more of you have heard of, andropause means that the hormones that are normally being produced that would cause production of sperm and male characteristics decline. Now there is something called hormone replacement therapy that I'll mention here, but will apply to females as well. Sometimes when the body stops producing hormones at the level at which they had been produced, it can cause really negative side effects for the person in terms of mood and in terms of general energy levels. And so it would be possible to treat someone who is experiencing andropause with hormone replacement therapy. Essentially, you would take supplements of the hormone that is missing. You could do that for any hormone, not just this one. So that's just an example of a way that it could be treated. Does anyone want to ask anything here? Okay. So that is what's going on with males. Now we're going to talk about females, and it's a little bit more involved. The same pathway, or more or less the same pathway, exists for females. We start with the hypothalamus, then on to the pituitary, but this time, instead of stimulating the testes, we stimulate the ovaries, which is the female reproductive structure that's making our gametes. So the same thing that was true for males is true here. This begins around puberty. So females are not producing hormones at these levels until early teen years, but the exact year is not something I can specify. The same thing that happened for males happens for females. The hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to make FSH and LH. So I'm not going to repeat their full names because we wrote them on the last one. So this same hormone setup exists for females. Same hypothalamus releasing hormone, same two anterior pituitary hormones. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about any of those before we talk about what they do? So FSH stimulates the production or the development of a follicle. And you might say, oh, well, that's a good name. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of a follicle. What a good name. So they're named really well in terms of female structures. The follicle contains the ovum, which is the fancy science word for the egg. Okay? So you might recall from our discussion way back when that a lot of meiosis for a female happens before she's even born. So she's got a bunch of follicles that haven't quite finished undergoing meiosis, right? The cell hasn't quite finished making the egg. FSH helps to stimulate this to continue happening. Now, LH stimulates ovulation. That is the release of the ovum. And you might say, oh, well, that name is not very good. But it also produces the corpus luteum. It's called the luteinizing hormone, corpus luteum. It means yellow body. The corpus luteum is the follicle after the egg is released. So we start with the same releasing hormone. The anterior pituitary produces FSH and LH, same two hormones. They don't have the same exact effect because now they're affecting ovaries instead of testes. But if I had to compare them, FSH is always stimulating the production of gametes. In males, it's the sperm. In females, it's the egg. And so if I had to generalize what FSH is doing, it is the thing that is stimulating the production of gametes. Now, aside from the development of the follicle and ovulation occurring, these two hormones, so FSH and LH, stimulate the production of progesterone and estrogen. So females have two hormones that are involved in the control of reproductive cycles, whereas males just have testosterone. Now, most of the time, they have negative feedback. You'll notice I said most of the time because there's a point where it isn't negative. So I'm just going to note here that usually the feedback is negative. So usually when there is a lot of estrogen or when there is a lot of progesterone, there will be negative feedback on the hypothalamus. I think that's what I'll say right now. Does anyone want to ask anything here? Okay. So we're talking about the menstrual cycle, and there are two parts to the menstrual cycle. The first is what is happening in the ovary, so it's called the ovarian part of the cycle. And then we'll talk on the next slide what's happening in the uterus. So there are two structures that are important to us here. So in the ovarian cycle, if I had to give you an average of how things go, day 1 to about day 14 is the follicular phase. Approximately day 14 to 28 is called the luteal phase. These are approximations because a menstrual cycle is supposed to be 28 days long, but I'm sure that if you spoke to any female, she could attest that it is never exactly 28 days, consistently anyways. Now, if we look at the picture is organized in sort of chronological order as if we were looking at a clock. So if I start here, there's about day 1. Around here is about day 14. So between day 1 and day 14, you can see on the picture that what is happening is that the follicle is developing. It goes from being very small to a bit bigger to being a follicle where you can actually see an ovum inside of it. And on day 14, ovulation should occur. Should. Now what we'll add to this picture, aside from what the structures are, is which hormones are causing this to happen. So you'll recall on the last slide, I said that FSH is stimulating the development of a follicle. So based on the pathway that we saw earlier, your hypothalamus stimulates your pituitary makes FSH, and FSH stimulates the development of a follicle. Now this developing follicle produces a bit of stuff. It produces a bit of estrogen and a bit of progesterone. So that is where the estrogen and progesterone are coming from. Now here's where things get a little bit weird. Estrogen, like I showed you before, has a negative influence on FSH. And so you might think, oh, well, as soon as the follicle starts developing, estrogen is going to limit the production of FSH, which is good. I don't want more than one follicle developing at a time. But here's the secret secondary pathway. Estrogen has a positive effect on GnRH, which stimulates LH. That is one of the only places where there is positive feedback. Normally, a hormone would inhibit the pathway that causes its production, but here, this estrogen, while it's inhibiting FSH, it's stimulating GnRH, which is stimulating LH. It's already inhibiting FSH, so I'm not getting more of it, but it's stimulating LH. On day 14, you get an LH surge. Essentially, the estrogen from the developing follicle stimulates a huge jump in the production of LH, and that is what causes ovulation. Now, so far, does anyone want to ask any questions? We're going to talk, this is just the ovary. When we do the uterus cycle, that's where we talk about the lining of the uterus. So this has been happening. A follicle developed. It made estrogen and progesterone. We have a good idea what the estrogen was doing so far. Zach asked, what about the uterine lining? That's where progesterone will come more into play. After ovulation has happened, you have a follicle that is ruptured and an ovum that comes out. The ovum is released into the fallopian tube, hopefully. And in the fallopian tube, if that is what the person has tried to accomplish, it might meet a sperm cell and cause the formation of a zygote. What happens after this is what we'll discuss after the break. So rest assured, this is not the end of the story. So the ovum is released, goes into the fallopian tube. What's left of the follicle becomes the corpus luteum. So remember I said that means yellow body. The luteum means yellow, corpus means body. Corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone, just like the follicle did before. So the same two hormones that were coming from the developing follicle are also coming from the corpus luteum. Now, as the corpus luteum degenerates, the production of those two hormones decreases. They're only being produced while the corpus luteum is still there. But eventually, it is going to degenerate. Around day 28, it should be degenerated. That should be the end of the corpus luteum. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions there? So, while the corpus luteum is producing estrogen and progesterone, they have a negative impact on the production of all of these hormones, which is good. I don't want more ovulation and I don't want another egg being produced yet. As soon as the corpus luteum degenerates, that negative feedback stops and I can produce GnRH again. Now, even though we're talking about the uterine cycle now, what's happening in the uterus, I like to compare that to what's happening in the ovaries so that you can see how what we just did compares to what's happening in the uterus. So the uterine cycle is where we're talking about the uterus. The follicular phase and the luteal phase are the same days. So follicular is 1 to 14, luteal is 14 to 28. So it's the same division. The first half is follicular, the second half is luteal. Now if you take a look at the picture, you can see that instead of showing an entire ovary, it's just got little pictures of what's happening. So like this would be day 1, this would be day 14, that would be day 28. Over here is day 1, day 14, day 28. So it's lined up approximately evenly. In the follicular phase, if you take a look, in the uterus, day 1 is when flow begins. This is when the uterus is shedding its lining. So the way you are supposed to count days of a menstrual cycle is that the first day there is menstrual flow and the uterus is shedding its lining, that is day 1. So if you take a look at the uterine cycle, this picture represents thickness. And you can see on day 1, the uterine lining is fairly thick. On day 1, flow begins unless the woman is pregnant. If she is pregnant, different things happen. But in a typical menstrual cycle, the uterus is very thick on day 1, and it will start shedding its lining and becoming progressively thinner. It takes anywhere between 5 and 7 days for the uterus to shed its lining. Now, does anyone have any questions there? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I will mention that, but just as a preview, birth control has an effect sort of in the luteal phase. It makes the woman's body think that she's pregnant so that she doesn't produce another egg, essentially. Okay? So when we get to the end, I'll mention it again. Now, if you take a look at what's happening, you might notice around here, so right after about the 7th day, the thickness of the lining starts to increase again. Around this day, so let's say this is day 7, between day 7 and 14, estrogen and progesterone are increasing because the developing follicle is producing them. Estrogen and progesterone that are being produced approximately after day 7, where the levels start to get a bit higher because the follicle is developing, they are the things that stimulate the lining of the uterus to thicken. So those two hormones that come from the ovary, specifically from the developing follicle, stimulate the uterus lining to become thicker. The purpose of this is that if the woman were to be pregnant, she needs a thick uterine lining to supply blood and oxygen and glucose and all of the things that the developing fetus would need. So far, so good? Okay. On day 14, where she ovulates, the corpus luteum is formed. The corpus luteum, remember, is producing estrogen and progesterone, which continue to stimulate the development of the uterine lining. So as long as estrogen and progesterone are being produced, the uterine lining thickens. When the corpus luteum degenerates, now estrogen and progesterone decrease and eventually stop being produced. When that happens, the lining sheds. So basically, the uterus depends on the ovarian cycle. If estrogen and progesterone are being produced, then the lining will thicken. If they are not being produced, or they stop being produced, like on day 28 when the corpus luteum degenerates, then the lining is not going to thicken and it will start to shed. Now I'm going to return to your question here about birth control. Depending on what type of birth control someone is taking, birth control contains some combination of estrogen and progesterone. Sometimes it's a derivative of them. There are lots of different types of birth control pills, but birth control pills contain one or both of them. There are some types that contain only progesterone and some that contain estrogen and progesterone. But if you take a look at what estrogen and progesterone do, they keep the uterine lining thick. They also continue to have negative feedback. If there is negative feedback, then your body is not going to produce GnRH. So you're not going to produce a follicle, and essentially she's not going to ovulate. That is what we are trying to stop from happening, is to make sure that ovulation doesn't occur. On some birth control pills, and again it depends the type, they would suggest that you take a placebo pill for 7 days so that the uterine lining can shed, even though you have this estrogen and progesterone that kept it thick. Now, so we are going to look at page 500 in the textbook.